The job posting didn't say much. Night dispatcher, Regional Water Authority. No experience required. Training provided. The pay was $14 an hour, which in 2019 wasn't good. But it was steady. And steady was the only thing I cared about by then. I'd been out of regular work for 8 months. The plumbing supply company I'd driven a delivery truck for had folded after the owner's son ran it into the ground. And I'd spent most of that year doing odd jobs that paid in cash and never added up to enough. My truck needed a transmission. My phone bill was 3 months behind. I owed my sister $400 she'd never ask about, but that I thought about every single day. So when a woman named Dolores from the Cordray Valley Water Authority called me back and asked if I could start the following Monday, I said yes before she finished the sentence. I should explain what the place was, because most people don't know these jobs exist. Cordray Valley sits in a stretch of high country about 90 minutes from the nearest real city, and the whole region runs off a system of reservoirs and pump stations that move drinking water down through a network of mountain towns. Somebody has to watch that system at night. Not the dam itself exactly. There's a separate crew for the dam. My job was at the control office, a low cinder block building about 4 miles from the main reservoir, where all the monitoring lines came together. Pressure readings, flow rates, the level gauges from 6 different intake points. If something went wrong overnight, an alarm came in, and the night dispatcher logged it and called the right person to deal with it. That was the whole job, as Dolores described it on the phone. Sit, watch the board, log the readings every hour, answer the phone if it rang, call the on-call engineer if anything tripped an alarm. She said most nights nothing happened at all. She said I'd have a lot of time to myself. She said that like it was a benefit, and to me then, it was. The building was easy to miss. I almost drove past it the first night. It sat back from the road behind a chain-link fence, with a gravel lot and one of those tall sodium lights that buzzed and painted everything the color of weak tea. There were 2 cars already parked when I pulled in. One was a county vehicle, white with the Water Authority seal on the door. The other was an old maroon Buick with a cracked back window held together by packing tape. The man who let me in was named Ed Brune. He was maybe 60, heavy-set with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a flannel shirt that smelled like cigarettes, even though I never once saw him smoke. He was the outgoing night man, the one I was replacing, and he'd agreed to stay on a week to train me before he retired. He shook my hand at the door and looked at me a second too long, the way some older guys do when they're deciding something about you. And then he said, "Have you ever done anything like this before?" I told him no. "Good," he said. "Easier to teach somebody who doesn't think they already know." Inside, the place was smaller than I expected. There was a front room with a counter and a couple of desks, a back hallway with a bathroom and a supply closet, and a door marked mechanical that Ed told me to leave alone, and then the control room itself, which was the heart of everything. The control room had one long console against the wall, covered in gauges and switches and a bank of monitors that mostly showed graphs and numbers. There was a swivel chair with a split seat cushion patched over with duct tape. There was an old coffee maker on a side table, with a pot that had a brown ring baked into the bottom from years of being left on the warmer too long. The whole building smelled like a basement. Not bad exactly, but close and mineral, like wet concrete and old paper and the inside of a thermos that hasn't been washed. I got used to it within a few nights, the way you get used to any smell. But that first night, it sat in the back of my throat and made me feel like I'd swallowed something. Ed walked me through the basics. He had a way of explaining things that made it clear he'd explained them many times before, in the same words, with the same little pauses. He showed me the log sheets, which were actual paper, printed on a dot matrix printer that lived in the corner and made a sound like a zipper being pulled when it ran. Every hour, on the hour, I was to read the gauges and write the numbers down in the right columns. Pressure here, flow there, reservoir level in the far column. 6 intake points, labeled 1 through 6. He showed me the phone, a beige desk model with a coiled cord, and the laminated sheet taped to the wall next to it with the on-call numbers. "Phone rings, you answer it," he said. "Most of the time it's nothing. Wrong number, or some homeowner who thinks we're the place to call about their water bill. We're not. You tell them to call the office in the morning. Sometimes it's the damn crew checking in. They'll say their name and their station number. You write it in the log." "What if it's an actual emergency?" I asked. He looked at me. "Like what?" "I don't know. A leak, a break in a line." "Then an alarm trips before anybody calls you," he said. "The board tells you before a person does. People are slow. The board's fast." He tapped the console. "You watch the board." That seemed reasonable. I wrote it down in the little notebook I'd brought, which I think amused him, because he didn't strike me as a man who'd ever taken a note in his life. Then he showed me the rules. I want to be careful here, because I've thought a lot about how these rules sounded that first week versus how they sound to me now. And I don't want to dress them up. At the time, they sounded like every other piece of workplace nonsense I'd ever encountered. Every job has a list of stupid rules that exist because of some incident decades ago that nobody remembers. You learn to nod and ignore the reasoning, and just do the thing. That's what I assumed these were. There was a typed sheet, laminated like the phone numbers, thumbtacked to a corkboard above the console. The paper had gone yellow and the corners were soft. The heading said, "Overnight Operating Procedure, Cordray Valley." And under that, there was a list. I read it that first night while Ed made coffee neither of us would finish. The first item said to log all 6 intake readings every hour without exception, even if a gauge appeared frozen or unchanged. The second said that if any reading from intake 4 came back as a negative number, I was to record it exactly as displayed and not adjust it. The third said that the phone was to be answered on or before the third ring, every time, regardless of the hour. The fourth said that if a caller gave a station number that was not on the laminated list, I was to thank them, write down the time, and hang up without responding to anything else they said. The fifth said not to call back any number that appeared on the caller ID if I did not recognize it. And the sixth, at the bottom, in slightly different type like it had been added later, said simply, "Intake 4 does not take calls. If you hear it, log it and continue." I read that last one twice and then asked Ed what it meant. He was pouring coffee and didn't turn around. "It means the line out at 4 crosses with something else sometimes. Old wiring. You'll get noise on it. Sounds like a voice once in a while." "It's not. You just write down that you heard it and you keep going." "Heard what, though?" "Noise," he said again, in a flat way that closed the subject. He brought me a cup of coffee I didn't want, and we moved on. The thing I keep coming back to is how easy it was to accept that. A voice on a crossed line is a real phenomenon. Anybody who's ever had an old landline knows you can sometimes pick up a fragment of somebody else's conversation. A ghost signal bleeding through from another circuit. It happens. So when Ed said it, I filed it under the same category as the gauge that might read frozen and the call I should hang up on. Workplace nonsense. Old building, old wires, old rules. I want to be honest that I also just needed the money too badly to ask the kind of questions that might have made Ed reconsider hiring me. There's a version of me that pushed harder that first week, that demanded real answers, And that version of me probably ends up somewhere better than I did. But that wasn't who I was that fall. I was a man with a dead truck, and a debt to his sister, and a coffee can full of overdue notices. And I wanted to learn the job, do the job, and keep the job. So I learned the rules the way you learn a phone number, without understanding them, just well enough to repeat them back. Ed stayed with me for 5 nights. They were slow, like he'd promised. We'd sit in the control room, and he'd tell me stories about the system, about the floods in the 80s, and the time a beaver dam upstream caused a 3-day crisis, and the regional director who'd been fired for skimming maintenance budgets. He was a good talker once he got going. Around 3 in the morning every night, he'd go quiet, though. And I noticed he always got up around then, and walked down the back hallway, and stood for a minute, near the mechanical door, not opening it, just standing. And then he'd come back and sit down, and not say anything about it. The 3rd night I asked him about it. "You go check something back there every night," I said. Around 3. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Habit, you'll get your own." "My own what?" "Things you do to get through the night," he said. "You'll see." I let it go. I figured every man who works alone in the dark develops little rituals, ways of marking time, ways of reminding himself he's still a person, and not just a thing that watches a board. I figured I'd develop mine. I didn't think much about the fact that his ritual involved standing near a door I'd been told not to open. The readings themselves were dull, which was a relief. 6 numbers every hour, hand-copied from the gauges into the log. 5 of the 6 intakes behaved like you'd expect. The pressures held steady. The flow rates drifted up and down a little with demand. The reservoir level dropped a hair through the night, the way it should, as towns downstream drew water. Normal, boring, the kind of boring I wanted. Intake 4 was different, and Ed had warned me it would be. 4's gauge didn't sit still like the others. Where intakes 1 through 3 and 5 and 6 would hold a number for hours, 4 crept. The flow reading on 4 would tick down slowly all night, a little every hour, like something was drawing from it that the system didn't account for. And every so often, maybe once a night, the flow on 4 would read as a negative number. -4, -11. Once, that first week, -31, which Ed wrote down himself with a grunt and didn't explain. "Negative flow," I said. "How does the flow go negative?" "It doesn't," Ed said. "Not really. Means water's moving backward up the line, which it can't, so it means the census reading something it doesn't have a word for. You don't fix it. You don't call anybody about it. You write it down exactly like it says. That's the rule." He tapped the laminated sheet. "Rule 2. I wrote it down exactly. -31. It looked wrong sitting there in the column, a negative number among all the positives, like a typo in a phone book. But I wrote it, and the night went on, and nothing happened. And by morning, I'd half forgotten about it. The thing about a slow job is that it teaches you to discount the strange. You spend so many hours with nothing happening that when something does happen, your first instinct isn't alarm, it's relief. Finally, something. A break in the monotony. So when small things started, in that first week and the weeks after Ed left, I didn't experience them as threats. I experienced them as content, something to think about, something to tell my sister about on the phone, which I did a couple of times, treating the job like a funny story about a weird old building, because that's what it was to me then. Ed's last night was Friday. He cleaned out his locker, which held nothing but a spare flannel and a paperback Western with the cover torn off, and he shook my hand again at the door, the way he had the first night. The sun was coming up behind him, gray and cold. and he stood there a second deciding something again. And then he said, "You'll be fine. It mostly takes care of itself. Just follow the sheet." "Which one's the most important?" I asked. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted reassurance. "Of the rules." He thought about it longer than I expected. Then he said, "The phone one. Third ring. You answer that phone by the third ring every time, no matter what you're doing. Even if you're on the toilet. Even if you're asleep. Especially if you're asleep." He looked at me. "You let it ring past 3, you'll wish you hadn't." "Why?" "Because then it's your turn to find out why," he said. And he got in his maroon Buick with the taped-up window and drove off. And I never saw him again. I didn't ask what he meant. At the time, it felt like another one of Ed's odd remarks. By the next night, I was alone in the building. The first few nights alone were fine. Better than fine, honestly. There's a particular peace to being the only person awake for miles, the only one minding a system that keeps a whole valley supplied with water. I felt useful in a way I hadn't in a long time. I did my readings. I answered the phone twice. Both times the damn crew checking in. Both times a man named Petrov, who gave his station number and his name, and a wry comment about the weather. I logged onto him. I drank bad coffee. I found a country station on the radio that came in clear after midnight and played old stuff, the kind my dad used to listen to. And I'd turn it low and let it fill the room so the silence didn't press in so hard. I developed my rituals, like Ed said I would. I'd do a lap of the building at the start of every shift, checking the doors, flipping on the hallway light that flickered for a second before it caught. I'd refill the coffee maker at once. I'd eat the sandwich I brought at 2. Small things to break the night into pieces. The flickering hallway light bothered me more than it should have. It was a fluorescent tube, the long kind. And it would come on with a stutter, dark light, before settling into a steady hum. One night, I stood under it and watched it do that and thought about replacing the tube myself, just to have something to fix. And then I remembered the supply closet was the one room in the building Ed hadn't shown me the inside of, and I didn't have a key for it, and I let the idea go. The first real anomaly, the first one I couldn't fold into the ordinary, happened during my second week alone. It was a Tuesday, around 2 in the morning. I'd just eaten my sandwich, and I was doing the 2 o'clock readings. 1, 2, 3, all normal. 4 was creeping down like always. 5, 6, normal. I was writing the 4, reading in the column, when I heard the phone. Except it wasn't quite the phone. The desk phone has a specific ring, a sharp electronic warble, and I knew it well by then. This was lower, a buzz more than a ring, like the sound was coming through water, like a phone ringing in another room with the doors shut. I looked at the desk phone. It was sitting there, silent, the little light on it dark. The sound was coming from the console. There was a speaker on the console, a small grill down near the bottom that I'd assumed was for alarms. I'd never heard it make a sound. Now it was buzzing, that low underwater buzz. And as I leaned closer, I realized it was coming specifically from the section of the board that handled intake 4. There was a little indicator light there, amber, that I'd never seen lit. And it was lit now, pulsing slowly in time with the buzz. I remembered the rule. Intake 4 does not take calls. If you hear it, log it and continue. So that's what I was going to do, log it and continue. I picked up my pen to write it in the log, and that's when the buzz resolved, the way a radio resolves when you nudge the dial. And for just a second, maybe 2, it stopped being a buzz and became a voice. It was a man, I couldn't make out words, not really. Just the shape of speech, the up and down of a human voice trying to say something. It sounded far away and close at the same time, the way a voice sounds when you put a shell to your ear and convince yourself you hear the sea. And then it was gone, snapped back into a buzz. And then the buzz cut out, and the amber light went dark, and the console was just a console again. I sat very still for a while. Then I did exactly what the rule said. I wrote in the log, 2:14 a.m. intake 4 audio, approximately 8 seconds, logged per procedure. I wrote it in steady block letters, the way I wrote everything, and I underlined per procedure without quite deciding to, like I needed to remind myself that hearing it was allowed, that this was a known thing, that Ed had told me about it, and it was on the sheet, and there was nothing to do but write it down. Old wiring, I told myself, crossed lines. A voice bleeding through from somewhere else, some ham radio operator in the hills, some trucker on a CB, some signal finding its way into the old copper out at 4. That's all it was. Ed had said so. The rule said so. I'd write it down and continue, and that's what I did. But I'll tell you what I didn't do. I didn't turn the radio back up. I'd had it off for the readings, and I left it off. And I sat in the quiet for the rest of that night. And every time the console made any sound at all, the click of a relay, the hum of the cooling fan, I looked at it. The voice came back twice more that week, both times around the same hour, both times the same way, the amber light, the underwater buzz, the few seconds where it almost became words, and then wasn't. Both times I logged it per procedure. By the third time, I'd stopped jumping when it started. That's the thing about anomalies I've learned. They become routine faster than you'd think. The first time something impossible happens, it cracks the world open. The third time, it's just a thing that happens at 2 in the morning, like the coffee maker gurgling or the hallway light stuttering on. I told myself I was handling it well, following procedure, being a professional. I even felt a little proud in a stupid way, like I was passing some test Ed had set up, proving I could sit with the weird parts of the job and not lose my head. What changed was the logs. About 3 weeks into being alone, I got curious about the older logs. The current log sheets went in a binder on the console, and when a binder filled up, it got moved to a shelf in the front room, where there were maybe 24 of them going back years. I started reading them on slow nights, partly out of boredom and partly because I wanted to see how other dispatchers had handled the intake 4 entries. I wanted to know if what I was seeing was normal. If every nightman for the last 20 years had logged the same buzz and the same negative numbers, they had. That was the first thing I noticed, and at first it reassured me. Page after page, year after year, the 4 readings creeping down, the occasional negative number, and every so often an entry like mine. Intake 4 audio, logged per procedure. Different handwriting, different men, but the same entries. It was comforting in a way. I wasn't crazy. The job had always been like this. But the more I read, the more something started to bother me. And it took me a while to put my finger on it. The audio entries weren't random. I'd assumed they were just crossed wires firing off whenever atmospheric conditions or old copper felt like it. But when I went back through several binders and started marking the dates, a pattern showed up. The audio events clustered. There'd be weeks, sometimes months, with nothing, just the normal readings, and then a stretch where the audio came almost every night, sometimes several times a night. And then it would go quiet again. And the negative flow numbers on 4 tracked with it. The bigger the negative number, the more audio entries clustered around that date. -4, you might get 1 buzz. -30, and there'd be a run of them, night after night. The entries getting longer. Intake 4 audio, approximately 20 seconds. Intake 4 audio, approximately 40 seconds. One entry, from a man whose handwriting I'd started to recognize, said intake 4 audio, approximately 2 minutes. And then under it, smaller, like he'd added it later, the word clear. I didn't know what clear meant. I didn't want to know. But I marked the date and kept reading. The other thing I noticed was the dispatchers themselves. There's a place at the top of each log sheet for the night man to sign in, his initials and the date. Over the years, the initials changed, the way they would as people came and went. But the turnover was faster than I expected for a job this dull. I'd been thinking of this as the kind of post a man holds for decades, like Ed had. And some did, but others lasted a few months, a year, and then a new set of initials would take over with no overlap, no training period like Ed had given me. One man's last entry on a Tuesday, a different man's first entry that same Friday, like the first man had simply not come back. People quit. I knew that. People take a job like this, find out it's lonely and the pay is bad, and they leave. That's the most ordinary thing in the world. I told myself that. But I noticed I'd started keeping a list in my notebook, the initials and the dates, who'd lasted and who hadn't. And I noticed that the men who hadn't lasted tended to disappear from the logs during the clusters, during the runs of audio entries. A man would be logging 4 audio every night for a week, the entries getting longer, and then his initials would just stop, and a new man would pick up a few days later. I want to be clear that I didn't leap to any conclusion. I'm not a dramatic person. My whole life I've been the guy who assumes the boring explanation, because the boring explanation is almost always right. People quit lonely jobs. Old wires make noise. Sensors glitch. I had a dozen ordinary reasons lined up for everything I was seeing, and I kept them lined up like a wall between me and the other thing, the thing I wasn't letting myself look at directly. But I started doing something I hadn't done before. I started standing near the mechanical door around 3 in the morning, the way Ed had. I don't fully know why. I think I wanted to understand his ritual. And I think part of me thought that if I stood where he'd stood, I'd feel whatever he'd felt. And it would tell me something. Mostly I just felt foolish. A grown man standing in a cold hallway in front of a locked door listening to his own breathing. But once, only once, I thought I heard something on the other side of that door. Not a voice. A sound like water moving through a pipe. A deep, slow gulping. The sound a big drain makes when it's pulling something down. It lasted a few seconds and stopped. I told myself it was the system. There were pipes everywhere in that building. Of course, there was water moving. That's the whole point of the place. I went back to my chair and didn't stand by the door again for a while. The night everything tilted, the night I stopped being able to keep the wall up, started like any other. It was a Thursday in early November. The cold had come down hard that week, and the gravel lot had frost on it when I pulled in. I did my lap, caught the hallway light on its stutter, started the coffee, took my chair. The readings at midnight were normal. 1 at 1 was normal, except 4 was already showing -8, earlier in the night than usual, and lower than I'd been seeing lately. I logged in. I didn't think much of it. I'd seen worse numbers in the old binders. Around 1:30 the audio started, and it didn't stop. It came on like always, the amber light, the underwater buzz. I reached for my pen to log it, expecting the usual 8 or 10 seconds. But it didn't cut out. The buzz held, and then it resolved. the way it had that first time, into the shape of a voice. And this time, it didn't snap back. It stayed. The man's voice came through the little speaker on the console, far away and close at once. And for the first time, I could make out a word. The word was help. I sat with my pen on the log sheet, and I didn't write anything. The voice came again. Help. And then more. Run together, distorted, like a recording played too slow and then too fast, but I caught pieces. Help me. The rest dissolved into the buzz, surged back, dissolved again. Help me. Help me. Like it was stuck, like a man with one thought left repeating it into the dark. The rule said to log it and continue. I knew the rule. I'd followed the rule a dozen times by then. But the rule was about noise, about crossed wires, about a buzz that sometimes sounded like a voice. The rule had never had a word in it. The rule had never said, help me. My hand was shaking, which surprised me because I genuinely thought I'd gotten used to this. I made myself write the entry. 1:34 a.m. Intake 4 audio, ongoing. Contains apparent speech. I stared at apparent speech. I'd never written anything like that before. None of the old logs had either, not that I'd seen. The men before me had written audio, approximately some number of seconds. They hadn't written what was in it. I wondered, sitting there with the voice still coming, whether that was a choice. Whether they'd all heard the same word and decided not to write it down. Whether not writing it down was the actual rule, the one under the rule, the thing Ed couldn't quite say. The voice went on for almost 4 minutes. I know because I timed it, watching the second hand on the wall clock crawl around, because timing it gave me something to do that wasn't listening to the words. Toward the end, it got clearer, the way one of the old entries had said, clear. For about 10 seconds at the end, before it cut out, the buzz dropped away almost entirely, and the voice came through clean. A man's voice, ordinary, tired, scared, and he said something I've never been able to stop hearing. He said, "Is somebody finally there? I've been calling for so long." And then the amber light went out, and the speaker went dead, and the console was just a console. And I was alone in a cinder block building 4 miles from a reservoir, with my pen still pressed to a log sheet I hadn't finished filling out. I didn't move for a long time. The radio was off. The coffee maker had finished and clicked over to its warmer with a small sound that made me flinch. The hallway light buzzed steady down the hall. I told myself the explanations. A recording. A prank. Some kids who'd found a way into the old phone lines. A voice from a CB radio bleeding through. Atmospheric skip. Old copper. I lined them all up, the whole wall of boring reasons, and for the first time, they didn't hold. Because a crossed line doesn't ask if somebody's finally there. A crossed line doesn't say it's been calling for so long. Those words were aimed. They were a response, like the man on the other end knew that this time, after all the times nobody had really listened, somebody had. I got up and I did the thing I'd told myself I wouldn't do. I went to the front room and I pulled down the binders. Then I started looking for the entry I'd marked weeks before, the one that said clear. I found it. The handwriting I'd come to recognize, a man whose initials were RM. The date was a little over 4 years ago. Intake 4 audio, approximately 2 minutes, and under it, smaller, clear. I flipped forward to find RM's other entries, to see how long he'd worked there, when he'd started, when he'd stopped. His initials went back about a year before that clear entry. Steady, every night, reliable. And then I found where they stopped. RM's last log sheet was dated 9 days after the clear entry. His handwriting on that last sheet was different, shakier. The readings were all there, logged on the hour like always, but down at the bottom, in the space where you're supposed to write any notes for the next shift, he'd written something that wasn't a reading and wasn't an alarm and wasn't anything I'd seen in any other log. He'd written, "It used my name tonight. If you're reading this, don't answer when it does. Don't say anything back. The second you answer it, knows you can hear it, and then it starts pulling. Ed knows. Ask Ed about the door." And then under that, the last thing RM ever wrote in that book, in letters pressed so hard the pen had torn the paper, "I don't think the man at the bottom of 4 is the one we should be afraid of." I sat down on the floor of the front room with the binder open in my lap. The hallway light buzzed. Somewhere in the walls, faint, 3 rooms away, I heard that deep, slow gulping sound again. The sound of a big drain pulling something down. And this time, it didn't stop after a few seconds. It kept going. And under it, almost too quiet to be sure, coming from the direction of the control room I'd just left, the console speaker began, very softly, to buzz. I closed the binder. I don't know why that was my first move, but it was. I closed it and set it back on the shelf where I'd found it, square against the others, like putting it away would put away what I'd read in it. Then I walked back down the hallway toward the control room. And with every step, the buzz from the speaker got a little louder, and the gulping sound in the walls got a little quieter, until by the time I reached the doorway, they'd traded places. The buzz steady now, and the water gone silent. The amber light on 4 was lit, pulsing slowly, the way it had before. I stood in the doorway and looked at it, and didn't go in. Looking back, the part that stays with me isn't the voice. It's what I thought about first. Not RM. Not the warning. Not the man asking for help. I thought about losing the job. The bills felt more immediate than the impossible thing sitting a few feet away. That's the choice I actually made. So I went in, and I sat down, and I sang and I logged the buzz. 4:02 a.m. intake 4 audio, buzz only, no speech, logged per procedure. It wasn't true. I'd told myself I wasn't going to listen. But you can't not listen. The ear doesn't have a lid. And somewhere in that buzz, low, I heard the man say something that might have been a number or might have been a name. And I wrote buzz only anyway because writing it down the other way meant I was the kind of man this was happening to. And I wasn't ready to be that man yet. The buzz stopped at 4:40. I logged that too. I finished my shift. The sun came up gray and hard over the frost in the lot. And I drove home with the heater rattling, and I didn't sleep. I just lay on top of my bed in my work clothes and stared at the water stain on the ceiling and thought about the word Ed had used. Pulling. RM had used it too. The second you answer it, knows you can hear it, and then it starts pulling. I didn't know what it meant, and I was afraid that I was going to find out the way you find out the temperature of water by being put in it. I went back the next night. The decision wasn't brave or complicated. I already knew the routines there better than I knew what came after quitting. Sometimes, that's enough to keep a person in the wrong place. I want to tell you about Dolores, because she's the next piece of this, and because she's the one who taught me that I'd had the system backward the whole time. I'd never met Dolores. She'd hired me over the phone, and I'd done all my paperwork through Ed, and the few times I'd needed something, I'd left a note in the day shift tray in the front room, and it had been handled by morning. But about a week after the long audio event, I came in for my shift, and there was a woman sitting at one of the front room desks, going through a binder. And she looked up at me, and I knew from her voice when she said my name that it was Dolores. She was older than I'd pictured, maybe 70. Small, with a kind of dry steadiness that some people get when they've worked one job their whole lives and stopped being surprised by any of it. She had a thermos and a sweater buttoned to the throat and a pair of those half glasses on a chain. She'd come in, she said, to do the quarterly log review. She did it 4 times a year, always at night, always alone, and she'd timed this one to overlap the start of my shift because she wanted to meet me. "You've been doing good work," she said. "Your logs are clean, easy to read. The last fellas were a mess, God rest him." That God rested him went through me like a wire. I asked, as casually as I could, what had happened to the last fella, meaning RM, though I didn't know his name yet, only his initials. "Robert," she said. "Robert Muntz. He retired." She said it without looking up from the binder, and then she did look up, over the half glasses, and added, "Down south somewhere. Arizona, I think. He doesn't keep in touch." I said that was nice, retiring somewhere warm. And she went back to the binder, and I went and started the coffee, and the whole time my hands were doing the coffee. My mind was turning over the fact that RM's last log entry was a man's handwriting torn into the paper by his own panic, and that no man who wrote it used my name tonight 9 days before he vanished from the record retirees to Arizona. He doesn't keep in touch. I thought about that line a lot afterwards. It was true in a way Dolores didn't seem troubled by at all. He didn't keep in touch. None of them did. Dolores stayed past midnight. I did my readings on the hour, and she watched me do the first couple, not in a checking way, more like she was confirming something to herself. And around 1, she put the binder down and took off the half glasses and asked me, plainly, "Has 4 been talking to you?" I'd practiced, in my head, a dozen versions of how I'd answer that question if anybody ever asked it. And every one of them had been a denial. But sitting across from this small old woman with her thermos, the denial wouldn't come. I said yes. I said it had been getting longer. I said last week it went almost 4 minutes, and I'd heard words. She nodded, slow, the way you nod at a diagnosis you've been expecting. "It does that in the cold months," she said. "Pressure differential," the engineers used to say, back when there were engineers who'd say anything about it. "Draws down harder when the towns draw down harder. November's always loud." She screwed the cap back on her thermos. "What did you do when you heard the words?" "I logged it," I said. "Per procedure." "Did you answer?" "No." She looked at me for a long moment, and I wore a tice. Understood that this was the actual review, that the binder had been a formality, and this was the part she'd driven out in the cold to do. "Good," she said. "That's the only thing that matters. You can log it wrong, you can spill coffee on the board, you can fall asleep at 4 and miss a reading, and I'll never say a word. But you do not answer 4. You don't say its name back. You don't say your own name where it can hear. And if it ever calls you on the desk phone—" She nodded at the beige phone with the coiled cord. "You let it ring. That phone rings before 3, you answer. That phone rings past 3, and you don't recognize the line. You let it ring all night if you have to." And there it was. The thing that turned the whole job inside out for me, sitting in my chest like a swallowed stone. I'd had it backward. I'd thought the rule about the 3rd ring meant I had to answer fast, or something bad would happen. Answer by the 3rd ring, every time, no matter what. Ed had made it sound like the most important rule, like failing to answer was the danger. But Dolores had just told me the opposite. Some calls you answer, some calls you let ring forever. The 3rd ring rule wasn't about answering fast. It was about telling the 2 kinds of calls apart, because the real calls, the dam crew, the wrong numbers, the homeowners. Those came in and rang like a normal phone, and you picked up by the third ring and dealt with them like a person. And the other kind, the kind that came up from 4, those didn't ring like a phone. Those rang past 3. Those rang and waited, because they weren't a person trying to reach you. They were a thing that had learned what a phone was, and had learned that a man at a desk will pick up a ringing phone almost without thinking, the way you'll catch a thrown thing before you decide to. I asked her how a call could come in on 4 when the rule said 4 doesn't take calls. She put her glasses back on. The conversation, I could feel, was closing, the way Ed's conversations used to close. 4 used to be a real intake, she said. A long time ago. There was a town up that valley, before the reservoir, before any of this. They flooded it to make the water. The whole town, the houses, the church, the people who wouldn't leave. That's the old way they did these things. In this state, you bought who you could buy, and you flooded the rest. She said it flat, like a fact about pipe diameter. 4's line runs down into where that town is, under the water. The sensor reads what's down there, and it doesn't have words for it, so it gives us numbers that don't make sense, and noise that sounds like talking. That's all it is. She paused. That's what we tell ourselves it is. And the negative numbers? When it's pulling water back up the line, she said. When something down there wants out. She stood up, gathered her thermos and her binder, buttoned her sweater a notch higher. You've been doing fine. Just keep logging it and keep not answering. And in 20 years you'll retire and somebody'll train the next one, same as Ed trained you. She paused at the door. Don't read the old binders so much. It doesn't help. The men who read the old binders are the ones who stopped being able to do the job. She knew. Of course she knew I'd been reading them. My list, my marked dates, my recognition of RM's handwriting. She'd reviewed my clean, easy-to-read logs, and somewhere in them she'd seen a man who was starting to look too hard. And she'd driven out in the November cold to tell him, gently, to stop looking. And then she left, and I heard her car start in the lot. And I was alone with the console and the third ring rule that meant the opposite of what I'd thought it meant. I'd love to tell you I took her advice. I want this to be the part where I quit reading the binders and just did my clean, easy job and waited out my 20 years. But Robert Muntz hadn't retired to Arizona, and I couldn't make myself believe he had. And the part of me that was a delivery driver who'd watched a business get run into the ground by a fool while everybody pretended not to see it. That part of me wanted to know what I was part of before I decided to keep being part of it. So I kept reading. And the thing I found, reading more carefully now, looking not at the audio entries but at the readings themselves, was that the system wasn't passive. I'd thought the negative flow on 4 was just the sensor failing, the thing Ed and Dolores both described, a number for something that had no number. But when I lined up the negative flow nights against the dispatcher turnover, against the dates when one man's initials stopped and another's began, the pattern was tighter than coincidence. The biggest negative numbers, the -30s, the 1 -51 I found from years back, those didn't just cluster near the disappearances. They landed on the disappearances. The night a man's initials stopped, 4 read its lowest. Like a balance. Like the thing down there had drawn something back up the line, and the gauge had measured exactly how much. And then the next thing, the thing that made my hands go cold on the binder. After each of those nights, after the big negative number and the vanished initials, the next several nights ran the opposite way. 4 would read positive, high, way over what the other intakes ran. flow pouring into the system from a line that, according to the engineers, wasn't supposed to carry any real water at all. As if, having taken something, it gave something back. As if the system got fed, and then the system, briefly, paid. I didn't understand it. I still don't, not really. And I want to be careful not to pretend I do, because pretending is its own kind of lie. But the shape of it was clear enough to make me sick. The job wasn't watching a system that kept a town's water safe. The job was tending a thing under the water that took a man every so often and gave water in return. And the rules, all of them, the log it and continue, the don't answer, the third ring. Those rules weren't there to protect the dispatcher. They were there to keep the trade running smoothly, to keep the man at the desk calm and useful and quiet right up until the night it was his turn, and then to make sure the next man came in and sat down without asking too many questions. We weren't the operators. We were the inventory. We just had to file the paperwork ourselves until our number came up. I thought about quitting every single day after that. I'd like that on the record. I would lie in bed and decide I was done. And then the phone bill would come, or the truck would refuse to start in the cold, and I'd have to wait an hour for it to turn over. And I'd think, just a few more checks. Just until the transmission's paid. Just until I'm even with my sister. And I'd go back. The thing about being broke is that it makes you tell yourself you'll deal with a big problem as soon as you've dealt with a small one. And there's always a small one. And the small one is always more urgent than the big one, even when the big one is your own life. That's not an excuse. I've stopped letting myself call it an excuse. It's just what happened. I stayed for the same reason Robert Muntz stayed. And the man before him. And the man before him. Because leaving cost money I didn't have, and staying only cost a fear I'd already gotten used to. December got colder and 4 got louder, the way Dolores said it would. The negative numbers came more often. The audio came almost every night now, and I logged it the dishonest way. Buzz only, no speech, even when there were words, because writing the words down felt like admitting I could hear it. And admitting I could hear it felt like the first step in the pulling. Then, 3 days before Christmas, a man named Carl Reyes started. I didn't know they were hiring anybody. Nobody told me. I came in for my shift, and there was a kid, maybe 23, sitting in my chair, with a county lanyard and a backpack, and the eager, slightly scared look of somebody on their first night at a job they don't understand. He stood up fast when I came in and stuck out his hand and said he was Carl. He'd been hired as a second night man. They were splitting the post into 2 shifts because of some budget line that had opened up. And Dolores had told him I'd show him the ropes. I knew, the second he said it, what was happening. I'd read enough of the binders by then. Splitting the post. A second man. A trainee. I thought about the entries where a man would log 4 audio every night, longer and longer. And then his initials would stop, and a new set would pick up a few days later. I thought about the -51. And I understood that the budget line that had opened up hadn't opened up at all. The thing under the water was loud this December. I was hungry. And the system, the actual system, whatever it was, had responded the way it always did when 4 ran low. It had brought in fresh inventory. By then, I understood enough to know Carl should never have accepted the job. I could have told him to leave. I didn't. I didn't tell him. I trained him. I told myself it was because he wouldn't have believed me. And that's probably even true. If somebody had told me, that first week with Ed, that the building traded men for water, I'd have decided I was working with a crazy old burnout, and I'd have done the job anyway because I needed it. Carl needed it too. He told me, over the first night, in that nervous, oversharing way new people have, that he had a baby coming in the spring, and his girlfriend's hours had gotten cut. And this job, $14 an hour and quiet, was going to be what got them through. I sat there and listened to him say the exact words I'd have said. The small problem that's more urgent than the big one. And I trained him on the readings and the log sheets and the coffee maker and the hallway light that stutters before it catches. And when I got to the rules, the laminated sheet thumbtacked over the console, I taught them to him the way Ed taught them to me. Flat, boring, old wiring, crossed lines, log it and continue. I taught him that the third ring rule meant answer fast, because that's the version that keeps you calm. And I told myself I'd teach him the real version later, once he was settled, once he could handle it. I never did. There's no later in a place like that. There's just the next reading, on the hour, forever, until there isn't. The truth was simpler than all the excuses I invented afterward. 2 dispatchers meant 2 possible choices. I believed the newer one would be chosen first. I let myself believe that was enough reason to stay quiet. The trainees disappeared more than the veterans. I'd seen it on the dates. A man would last years, and then a second man would come in. And within a few weeks, the second man's initials would stop, and the first man's would keep right on going, clean and easy to read. I didn't warn Carl because warning Carl meant evening the odds between us, and I did not want the odds evened. I wanted him standing between me and the water. That's the truth. I trained him well. I was kind to him. I bought him a coffee from the gas station on the way in one night because he looked tired. And the entire time, I was setting him in front of me like a sandbag against a flood. The night it happened was the 2nd of January. I remember because I'd written the wrong year on the log sheet twice, the way you do in early January, and had to cross it out and initial the correction. And Dolores hates corrections. And I remember being annoyed about something that small while the rest of it was happening. We were both on that night. The post was supposed to be split, his shift and mine on different nights. But the holiday schedule had us overlapping, both of us in the building, which I realize now was probably not an accident either. 4 had been running low all evening, -12 at 10, -19 at 11, -28 at midnight. The lowest I'd ever logged. The audio was constant, the buzz never fully stopping now, just rising and falling. And under it, all night, the words, "Help me. Is somebody there?" The same loop, the drowned man at the bottom of the line. Except I'd stopped being sure it was a man, stopped being sure it was anything that had ever been a man. Because Dolores's words kept coming back. It gives us noise that sounds like talking. That's what we tell ourselves it is. Around 1, the desk phone rang. It rang past 3. I counted. I always count now. 1, 2, 3, and then a 4th ring, and a 5th. And the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. A long string of digits that didn't match any format a phone number should have. More digits than a phone number has. I knew the rule. Let it ring. Don't answer. I'd built my whole survival around that rule. I let it ring. Carl reached for it. He was new. The 3rd ring rule, the version I taught him, said answer fast, answer by the 3rd ring, every time, no matter what. I'd drilled it into him myself. A good employee, eager, trying to do the job right while the veteran sat there frozen. He reached across the desk and he picked up the phone on the 6th ring and he said, "Cordray Valley Water, this is Carl." I could have knocked it out of his hand. The phone was 18 inches from me. I had time. I'm not going to pretend I didn't have time, because the whole rest of my life is built on the fact that I had time, and I used it to do nothing. I sat in my chair, and I watched a 23-year-old with a baby coming in the spring put his ear to the receiver, and I kept my hands flat on the console, and I let him. His face did something I don't have good words for. It went still first, the way you go still listening to bad news, and then it went confused, his eyebrows pulling together, and he said, "Who is this?" And then he said, quieter, "How do you know that?" And then he didn't say anything at all. He just listened. The amber light on 4 was pulsing fast now, faster than I'd ever seen it, and the gulping sound had started up in the walls, that deep, slow drain pull. And the flow reading on 4 was dropping while I watched it, -30, -40, the numbers ticking down on the screen like a countdown. And Carl stood there with the phone against his ear, and his free hand had come up to grip the edge of the desk, and his knuckles were white. I said his name. I did do that at least. I said, "Carl, Carl, hang it up." But I said it quietly. I said it the way you say something you want to be on record as having said without actually wanting it to work. He didn't seem to hear me. Whatever was coming through that line had all of him. He said one more thing. He turned his head, slowly, and he looked right at me, and his eyes were wrong, glassy and far away like a man talking in his sleep, and he said, "It says it's been waiting for me. It says my name's already in the book." And then he set the phone down, gently in its cradle, the way you'd set down a phone after a normal call. And he walked out of the control room and down the back hallway toward the mechanical door. I had time to stop him. I didn't. Everything else happened because of that. The mechanical door was supposed to be locked. Ed had told me to leave it alone. I'd never once seen it open. And I told myself in that 15 seconds that it was locked. That he'd reach it and rattle the handle, and the spell would break, and he'd turn around confused, and we'd never speak of it. I told myself that so I wouldn't have to get out of my chair. The door wasn't locked. It opened for him. I heard it. The long groan of a heavy door that hasn't moved in years. And then I heard the sound from behind it. That gulping drain pull. Loud now, loud and wet and close. And Carl's footsteps went down, not forward, down, like there were stairs behind that door I'd never known were there. And the sound of the water came up to meet him. And then the door swung shut on its own, with a sound like a vault closing. And the gulping stopped, and the buzz stopped, and the amber light on 4 went dark. The flow reading on 4, when I finally made myself look at it, was -51. And then, as I watched, it began to climb. -40, -20, 0. And then positive, climbing, 12, 30, 45, water pouring into the system from a line that didn't carry real water, the reservoir level on the main gauge ticking up for the first time in weeks. The whole valley's supply quietly replenishing in the dark, while I sat alone in a cinder block building with one empty chair beside me and a phone that had gone back to looking exactly like a phone. I want to tell you what I did next, because it's the part that I think about more than the door, more than Carl's face, more than any of it. I logged in. I picked up my cheap county pen, and I filled out the rest of the readings for 1 in the morning, all 6 intakes, in my clean, easy-to-read block letters, the way Dolores liked them. And when I got to the bottom of the sheet, to the notes space, the same space where Robert Muntz had torn the paper warning me, I wrote, 1 AMC. Reyes departed early, personal. And then I sat there and looked at that sentence, departed shift early, personal, and I understood, finally, completely, what I was looking at. I understood why the old logs never said what was in the audio. I understood why Robert Muntz's last clean entry before the torn paper one was so ordinary, so calm, I understood that the lie wasn't something the system forced on us. The lie was the job. The actual work, the thing they paid $14 an hour for, wasn't reading the gauges. It was writing departed shift early, personal in steady letters with a steady hand, so that in the morning the day shift would file it, and Dolores would review it 4 times a year and find it clean and easy to read. And nobody, ever, would have to know that the water in their taps had a name in it. I almost wrote the truth. I want that on the record too, for whatever it's worth, which I know is nothing. I had the pen against the paper, and I almost wrote what happened. The phone, the door, the stairs I never knew were there, all of it, the way RM almost did. But RM wrote his truth, and then his initials stopped 9 days later. And I had read enough binders to understand that the men who told the truth in the book didn't last. And I wanted to last. So I crossed nothing out. I departed early, personal stand. And I finished my shift. And I did the 2 o'clock readings and the 3 o'clock readings. And at 3, I got up out of habit and walked down the hall and stood in front of the mechanical door, the way Ed used to, the way I'd started to, and I understood his ritual finally. He wasn't checking the door. He was apologizing for it. He was standing there every night with the men he'd let it have, the way I'd be standing there every night from now on with Carl. Dolores called me at home 2 days later, not about Carl. She never mentioned Carl, not then, not ever. And I never brought him up. And the not bringing it up was so total, so mutually understood, that it was its own kind of confession between us. She called to tell me they were making me senior night man. A raise, she said, 60 cents an hour. And the post was going back to a single shift, just me. The budget line had closed. And they wouldn't be bringing anybody else on for a while. She said it the way you'd report any small administrative thing. And then, right before she hung up, she said, "Robert trained well, but he read too much. You don't read so much. That's why you'll do fine." And I understood that she'd known about the binders all along. Knew about RM's note. Knew that I'd read the note and stayed anyway. And that staying anyway was exactly the qualification the senior post required. The job didn't go to the man who didn't know. It went to the man who knew and kept logging buzz only, no speech regardless. I took the raise. I'm not going to pretend I agonized over it. 60 cents an hour is $24 a week, is about $100 a month. And $100 a month was the truck payment. And I took it, and I paid my sister back the $400 that February. And she said thank you and asked how the job was going. And I told her it was quiet. I told her it was quiet. That's the word I used. I'm still there. That's all the proof this story really needs. It's been a few years now. I'm the one who trains the new ones. On the rare nights they bring a new one. And I train them the way Ed trained me. Flat and boring, old wiring, log it and continue. Answer by the 3rd ring. I teach them the version of the rule that keeps them calm. I tell myself, every time, that I'll tell them the real version later. And there's never a later. And I've stopped believing there will be. And I keep teaching it anyway because a calm trainee is a useful trainee, and a useful trainee is one who'll be sitting in the chair the night the phone rings past 3 instead of me. 4 still talk. Louder in the cold months, quiet in summer, the way Dolores said. I log it dishonestly. The negative numbers still come. Every so often, less often now, the budget line opens up, and a second man arrives with a backpack, and a story about why he needs the money. And I'm kind to him. And I buy him a coffee, and I train him well, and I do not warn him. And I do not even feel the thing I used to feel when I don't warn him, which is the part that scares me more than the door ever did. I've gotten good at the job, The actual job. The departed shift early, personal job. Robert Muntz was wrong about one thing in his torn paper note. He wrote that he didn't think the man at the bottom of 4 was the one we should be afraid of. I used to read that as a warning about Dolores or the county or whatever larger system kept the trade running. But I think he meant something simpler and worse. I think he meant us, the men in the chair, because the thing under the water only wants what it wants, the way water wants to find its level, the way a drain wants to pull. It doesn't lie. It doesn't write departed shifts early, personal. It doesn't train the next man badly on purpose. It doesn't sit 18 inches from a ringing phone with its hands flat on the console. We do that. The thing in the water is just hungry. The men at the desk are the ones who keep setting the table and writing down that nobody ate. Last week, a number I didn't recognize came up on the desk phone. More digits than a phone number has. It rang past 3. I let it ring, the way I always do, the way I'm good at now. It rang 11 times and stopped. Then it rang again, immediately, the same number. And this time, when I looked at the little screen, the caller ID had resolved into something it never had before. Not a string of digits. A name. My own name, on the screen, calling the desk where I sit every night. And the amber light on 4 had come on and was pulsing slowly, patient, the way it does when it's settling in for a long one, and the flow reading had just dropped to -4. I haven't answered it. It's still ringing some nights. I let it ring, and I buzz only, no speech. And I finish my readings, and I drive home in the cold, and I tell my sister the job is quiet. And every night I sit a little longer in the lot before I go in, looking at the one sodium light buzzing over the gravel, doing the arithmetic I've always done, the small problem that's more urgent than the big one. And every night the arithmetic comes out the same, and I go in, and I sit down, and I answer the phone when it rings before 3.